How did the British Empire rule the world without income tax? Discover the dark secrets of history. Subscribe now.
Imagine an empire that controlled nearly a quarter of the world's population. An empire with the most powerful navy in history. An empire that fought wars on every continent. Now imagine this: that empire had no income tax for most of its existence. No tax on what you earned. No tax on your salary. No tax on your trade. How is that possible? How did Britain fund its armies, its fleets, its secret intelligence, and its global expansion, without taking a single penny from the pockets of its own people? Today, we open the empire files and uncover the shocking truth about how the British Empire ran the world. For centuries, with almost no taxes. Let that sink in. The British Empire, at its peak in the 18th century, was the largest empire in human history. It spanned 13 million square miles. It ruled over 400 million people. It had a military budget that would be worth billions today. And yet, the British government did not impose a permanent income tax until 1799. That's right, 1799. So what did they do before that? How did they pay for the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars? How did they build the East India Company's private army, which was larger than the British Army itself? The answer is not what you expect. And it's darker than you think. First, let's understand what they did tax. Instead of taxing income, the British government relied on what economists call regressive taxes, taxes that hit the poor harder than the rich. They taxed salt, beer, windows, soap, candles, tea, and even paper. Yes, paper. Every time a commoner bought a loaf of bread, a portion went to the crown. Every time a farmer lit a candle at night, he paid a tax. Every window in a house was counted and taxed. If you had more windows, you paid more, but the rich could afford it. The poor, they lived in windowless hovels or bricked up their windows to avoid the tax. This was not fair, but it was effective, and it was invisible to the aristocracy. But the real money came from customs and excise duties. Think about this: by 1760, over 70% of British government revenue came from taxes on imported goods, tea, tobacco, sugar, and rum. And who produced those goods? The colonies. The American colonies, the Caribbean islands, and later, India. So in reality, the British people were not paying the taxes, the colonized people were. Every pound of sugar from Barbados, every chest of tea from China, every bale of cotton from India, all were taxed before they even reached London. The British government was essentially outsourcing its tax burden to its colonies. And if the colonies protested, they sent the navy. Now, let's talk about wars. The British Empire was at war almost constantly between 1689 and 1815. That's over 120 years of conflict. How did they pay for it? The answer is debt. Yes, the British government borrowed money, huge amounts of it, from the Bank of England, which was founded in 1694 specifically to lend money to the crown. But here's the twist: they didn't borrow from foreign banks. They borrowed from their own rich merchants, the same merchants who were making fortunes from the slave trade, from sugar plantations, and from opium smuggling in China. These merchants would lend money to the government at high interest rates. And the government would repay that debt using future customs revenues, which came from, you guessed it, the colonies. So the poor British taxpayer never paid a penny. The burden was carried by the colonies, the enslaved, and the indentured laborers. And then there was the East India Company, the most powerful corporation in human history. By 1765, this private company had its own army of 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army. It collected its own taxes. It printed its own currency. It waged its own wars. And here's the shocking part: the British government did not fund the East India Company. The company funded itself, and then paid dividends to the British Crown in exchange for royal charters. So when the British government needed money for a war, they would simply ask the East India Company for a loan. And that loan would be repaid using the revenue from Indian land taxes, taxes collected from millions of Indian peasants. So the British Empire was not just taxing its colonies, it was privatizing the tax collection itself. Now, let's uncover a darker secret. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the British government did something called tax farming. They would sell the right to collect taxes to private individuals, tax farmers. These tax farmers would pay the government a lump sum up front. Then they would go out and collect the taxes themselves, often with violence, intimidation, and extortion. They would charge far more than the legal amount. The extra, that was their profit, so the government got its money without lifting a finger. The tax farmers got rich, and the common people, both in Britain and in the colonies, were crushed under illegal and excessive taxation. But the government could claim, we didn't raise taxes. And technically, they were telling the truth. There was only one direct tax that the British government imposed on its own people before 1799, the land tax. But even that was a joke. The land tax was based on outdated valuations from 1692. So by 1750, a wealthy landowner was paying the same tax as he did in 1692, even though his land had doubled or tripled in value. Meanwhile, the new merchant class, the ones making millions from slave ships and opium, paid almost nothing in direct taxes. So the richest people in Britain paid the least, and the poor paid the most through hidden taxes on everyday goods. This is what historians call an inverted tax system, where the poor finance the empire, and the rich finance the wars, but only through loans that they profit from. Here's the genius of the system, if you can call it genius. The British government made taxes invisible. You didn't see a deduction from your salary, because there was no salary tax. You didn't see a bill from the Crown. You just paid a little extra for your tea, a little extra for your beer, a little extra for your candles. And you never connected that to the wars in America, or the conquest of India, or the slave trade in Africa. The government kept the people distracted with patriotic songs, royal ceremonies, and military parades. Meanwhile, the real cost of empire was paid by the colonized, the enslaved, and the poor, in silence. And the rich became richer. So what changed in 1799? The Napoleonic Wars. Britain was fighting for its survival against France. The war was so expensive that the government could no longer rely on customs revenue, tax farming, or loans from the East India Company. In 1799, Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger introduced the first permanent income tax, a tax of 10% on all incomes above £60. It was supposed to be a temporary war measure, but as we all know, no tax ever goes away. The income tax was abolished in 1802, then reintroduced in 1803, and it has never truly disappeared since. But here's the irony, the British Empire had already become the world's superpower, without income tax, for over 150 years. And they did it by making the poor pay, the colonized suffer, and the rich invest in war bonds. So, what does this teach us? It teaches us that empires don't run on noble ideals. They run on hidden systems of extraction. They run on invisible taxes, privatized enforcement, and psychological manipulation. The British Empire didn't tax its people, but it taxed the world. And it did so with such cunning that most Britons believed they lived in a free and fair system. Today, we still see echoes of this, in how corporations avoid taxes, in how governments borrow from private banks, in how the poor pay more as a percentage of their income than the rich. The Empire Files is not just about history. It's about the present, because the same mechanisms that funded the British Empire are still funding the modern world, they're just better hidden. The British Empire had no income tax until 1799. But they didn't need it. They had colonies. They had slaves. They had opium. They had debt. And they had a population that never asked questions. But we are asking questions now. That is what the Empire Files is all about. If you found this eye-opening, hit the subscribe button. And in the next video, we will uncover how the East India Company secretly owned the British government. This is the Empire Files, where history speaks truth to power. See you in the next file.